My name, as I think most of you know, is Michael Demariam. I'm director of the African Studies Center here at BU. I'd like to welcome you all to the second Rodney lecture of the fall 2021 semester. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Babacar Mbaye. He's the chair of the Department of English at Kent State University, where he's a full professor. We are really, really delighted to have him. He's a native of Senegal, received his PhD in American Culture and Studies from Bowling Green University back in 2002. He has a wide variety of research interests, Pan-African literature, film, music, and music and Black post-colonial and transnational cultures. He is the author of many books and many articles. I'll mention a couple of his books. Black Cosmopolitanism and Anti-Colonialism, Pivotal Moments, published with Routledge in 2017. The Trickster Comes West, Pan-African Influence in Early Black Diaspora Narratives. That's from Mississippi in 2009. And the co-editor of Crossing Traditions, American Popular Music in Local and Global Contexts with Scarecrow Press in 2013. And he's got, I think, another edited volume as well with Lexington Books, published quite recently in 2019. So again, we're super excited to have Professor Mbaye with us. He comes highly regarded and recommended. Today, the title of his talk is Pan-Africanism in the Epics of Shaka Zulu and Sundiata Keita. Professor, I will turn it over to you. And again, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Dr. Michael Waldemariam. I would like to express my sincere thanks and appreciation to you, to Dr. Eric J. Smith, to Dr. Edward Boustin, and also especially to my friend and brother, Professor Falungom. I thank the African Studies Center of Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies for having invited me the second time. I do remember that on May 2nd, 2011, I was invited to give a talk entitled Africa and Colonial New England in Phyllis Whitley's Poetry. So I really appreciate this opportunity to come back to give a talk at the African Studies Center of Boston University. The title of my talk, as you mentioned, is Pan-Africanism in the Epics of Shaka Zulu and Sundiata Keita. And I would like to first start with an exploration of, I would say, a mention of the literature to which I am referring, my key references. And in this literature, the first book that I would like to mention is entitled Shaka, was published the last time it was published was in 1981, but it was initially published in 1925 by a Christian mission in Lesotho, where Thomas Mofolo was from and where Thomas Mofolo actually worked. And in 1931, an edition of the story was published by F.H. Dutton, a British writer, and it was 50 years later, 50 years after 1931, that Daniel Kunene got it published. And in the edition of the book that was published under the sponsorship with the introduction of Daniel Kunene, the author makes the point that this book is one of the greatest texts in African literature. It is not that well known, and it is a text that inspired many versions of the epic of Shaka that were told by a number of writers. And one of these writers was Leopold Sédar Senghor, who in 1951 in Ethiopic rendered a poem, an homage, an elegy to Shaka Zulu. Another writer, of course, that wrote about it is Seydou Badjan, who turned it into a play. And another writer is a Congolese author, Chikaya Utamsi, who also turned it into a drama. So I would like to start with the fact that Thomas Mofolo's version of the Epic of Sundiata seems to be the oldest and the first one to be published. And that in the introduction to the epic, Mofolo wrote in a novel form. Daniel Kunene says that a translated version of the text was available already in 1931. The book's capital stature in African literature that I mentioned earlier is not surprising because it is a pivotal example of literary Pan-Africanism. And here I would like to discuss what I mean by literary Pan-Africanism. The concept itself was popularized by the book entitled Literary Pan-Africanism, History, Context, and Criticism, published in 2005 and written by Crystal Temple. And within the book, Crystal Temple argues that one way to conceptualize literary Pan-Africanism is to look at the ways in which the African intellectual, the African critic, examines the relationships between Africans and African Americans as represented in African American writings. Specifically, Temple invites the scholar of literary Pan-Africanism to demonstrate the ways in which, one, the text seeks to regenerate relationships, historical understanding, and future interaction between Africans and the descendants of the Africans dispersed through the European enslavement. Second, she argues the writer, the author of or the scholar of literary Pan-Africanism should pay attention to the ways in which the African-American writer introduces mutual understanding and nurtures the relationships between Africans and African-Americans. Third, the scholar of literary Pan-Africanism, according to Crystal Temple, should also pay attention to how the philosophy and ideals of the narrative parallel tenets of contemporary and or traditional Pan-African ideology. She has about 7 criteria that she lists. So I argue that while Temple's ambitious work is praiseworthy due to its emphasis on how Africans perceive African Americans, its focus on this representation as a distinctive characteristics and requirement of literary Pan-Africanism is somewhat problematic. I argue that it is problematic because it tends to reinforce what Paul Gilroy in his book, The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness, describes as African-American monumentalism or exceptionalism. And Gilroy berates those two concepts or those two tendencies, while he himself ends up reinforcing, I would say, a neglect, a denial of Africa and its role in modernity. Yet, however, to his credit, Gilroy makes a compelling critique of African-American particularity when, as the critic John Cullen Grusser states, he decries it in The Black Atlantic as, quote unquote, the belief that because of their experiences in the West and adoption of Christianity, Black Americans were the people best qualified to lead Africans and members of the diaspora to the bright future foretold by them. So theorizing literary Pan-Africanism mainly as African writers' depictions of African Americans resuscitates the above exceptionalism and ignores how the term can have a variety of meaning, such as continental Africans' perceptions of themselves and of their history, and also of the history of all Blacks, including those of the diaspora among whom African Americans belong. So in this vein, Walter Rodney would have somewhat disagreed with Temple's definition of Pan-Africanism, since he partially perceives it as an inquiry that should begin with the connections between not only Blacks of Africa and the Caribbean, and end with the links among the world's downtrodden peoples. By contrast, African intellectuals generally conceptualize Pan-Africanism in a fashion which, though emphasizing the importance of the African diaspora and world-class struggles against domination, be it capitalist or otherwise, stresses the necessity of continental unity. Consequently, from the vantage point of African intellectuals, literary Pan-Africanism would primarily mean a study of how African writers theorize the common issues facing Africa and how they can be overcome through celebration of a shared sense of history, cultures, and destinies between not just continental Africans, but also between these populations and Blacks of the diaspora. So this open-ended conception of Pan-Africanism is apparent in Emmanuel Geis's following statements, that the main concern of 20th century Pan-African writers has been to prove Africa's right to independence and the possibility of its rapid development through the introduction of modern techniques. So this chapter or this work contributes to the above conversations by exploring the roots of literary Pan-Africanism in the epics of Shaka Zulu and Sundiata. These narratives represent the two respective heroes' personifications of disembodiment, of both personification and disembodiment of Pan-Africanism through their life cycles and relationships with their particular families and kingdom. So first, I would like to give a brief introduction of course, the significance of this text. We do know that the epic of Jibril Tamsin Nyan was initially published in 1960 under the title Sundiata ou Lepope Mandeng, and that it was in 1965 that the Longman edition that we use was published. The text really is quite similar to Shaka Zulu because it is a story about exile. It is also a story about a young man, a young boy who grows up to be a man, who witnesses the suffering of their mother, who is forced by a number of factors to leave home, and therefore, you know, the hero's cycle, the hero's journey and motive are represented and reflected in both stories. But the most important thing here to remember is the extent to which repudiation can lead to a breakdown of society. You know, something similar to the rupture of the great chain of being. You know, that English concept can be reflected, is also reflected within both of these epics, within an African context. But first, I would like to talk about Shaka Zulu. You know, given if I have more time, I'll come back to some of these slides and give us more context. But since I would like to really to have a number of feedback from the audience, I'm going to try to keep my presentation, the entire presentation, at least to 30 minutes. So that we can have more time for questions and answers. So I'm going to just move on to Shaka Zulu and say that from the onset of this novel, Thomas Mofolo's Shaka, the author suggests that this epic is steeped into literary Pan-Africanism, as is visible in his reference to various groups that composed South Africa during the early 18th century. Mofolo describes these groups such as the Hoi, the Batswana, the Basotho, the Bakone, the Matabele, and the Soto, among others, as nations rather than as tribes, thus countering European colonialist appellations of colonized populations. One also notices early in this book that Mofolo is nostalgic of the times when South Africa was independent before the arrival of Europeans, thereby enjoying a sovereignty that was visible in its people's ownership of and closeness to the land where they lived. He writes, "The reader must understand that we are describing how the nations were situated long ago when the people were still settled upon the land. It is interesting that Mofolo describes the original inhabitants of South Africa as settled upon the land, since this representation shows us that the Lesotho people, the Hoi Hoi people, and other South Africans, you know, were original inhabitants, you know, of these lands. So therefore, they had settled on it before the Europeans came and called themselves the real settlers. And before the Europeans came and began to lay claims on these very lands. In order to understand Mofolo's books, one need to first know who Shaka was. According to Kwame Anthony Appiah and Henry Louis Gates, Shaka Zulu was born about 1787 and died in 1828. Hailed as the greatest of African military leaders, Shaka created the Zulu Empire in Southern Africa. Both historical records and oral traditions suggest that Shaka was special, since the circumstances of his birth were extraordinary. First, Zulu traditions relate the following. Conceived out of wedlock, Shaka was born to a Zulu chieftain called Senzangahona and an orphaned princess called Nandi from a neighboring tribe who quickly married before Shaka's birth. But as legend also suggests, Shaka was born with supernatural qualities. According to Mofolo himself, when Shaka was born, a messenger told his father, quote unquote, "There has been born to you a boy, an ox of the vultures. And indeed, there never was a child for whom these words were more fitting," end of quotation. Almost foretelling his son's might, Senzangahona himself sent a messenger to tell his overlord that, quote unquote, he had obtained a herd boy who would watch his herds, who would fight his wars, who would succeed him in the kingship, end of quotation. Yet, Senzangahona relinquished all these wishes as Nandi's co-wives, especially one of them, who gave birth to Shaka's siblings, known as Fokazana and Dingana, were about to tell the great king Jobe that Nandi was married when she was already heavy. For fear of seeing Nandi, her age mate, and himself killed by Jobe, he, Senzangahona, declared that Shaka was no longer heir to the kingship and that Mufokazana would instead be his successor. Consequently, when Shaka was a young boy, he had to go on exile with his mother and leave his father's town of Nobamba. Later in the book, we are told that Nandi and Senzangahona suffered from guilt, and Senzangahona, fearing that his crime would be exposed, went to the length of plotting to kill his own son. Yet, if Senzangahona had not committed this shameful deed in his youth, Shaka would have been at his home at Nobamba, a precious child, a child dearly loved by his father. Destiny has a strange way of unfolding because while he was forced out of his father's town, Shaka learned to fight and fend for himself. He also learned to demonstrate Pan-Africanism through his might and his ability to help numerous people away from his homeland. Even if his father later successfully pleaded for his return to Kube, another town where Shaka and his mother found refuge, Senzangahona initially banished them from the city and had promised, quote unquote, that Nandi would never again set foot in Nobamba. In this sense, Shaka's epic follows the cycle of the hero's exile. Next, when he was a young child, Shaka killed a lion that was terrorizing Kube and later was unscathed when his peers plotted to have him killed by a roaming hyena while he was watching them sleep in their huts. Even if Shaka was left alone by the hyena and killed a lion that attacked him, his age mates kept beating him and ridiculing him, reminding us of a similar treatment that Sundiata also refused from his peers when he was crippled. Yet Shaka persevered while he was still a young lad, as his mother took him to a woman healer who gave him 2 medicines and ordered him to go to a river before prophesying that this child will receive blessings that exceed all expectations. Shaka's power is connected to that of a snake, since always at the end of a fight, he would feel a sense of happiness and experience a wonderful feeling of relaxation, like a poisonous snake, which after biting a person lies sick until that person dies, whereupon it casts its skin and begins to move about again. Shaka's new power scared his peers, whom he killed or defeated with a stick. Shaka's power stems from his bond with a snake, or is apparent at the moment when he goes to the river in which a giant serpent of immeasurable length surrounds him, licks his face, and disappears soon before a mysterious voice from the reeds, says, and I wasn't gonna read this quotation because it's quite long. So here we have like a different aspect of Shaka, which if you put them together, do suggest that on the one hand, he was a Pan-African, I would say, gatherer, uniter. He was a great general, a great soldier, a great strategist. Yet there are many other aspects of Shaka, his bloodthirstiness, for instance, his random killings of people, his excessive authoritarianism, that do suggest that Shaka was not a Pan-Africanist from a certain extent. But let me talk a little bit about some of the factors that kind of suggest that Shaka story, or at least his myth, does reflect a number of literary Pan-Africanist elements. Despite its violent record, Shaka's story is relevant to the study of literary Pan-Africanism because it reflects the Black hero's role as defender of the poor, the weak, and the vulnerable that he played during most of his childhood. In Shaka's myth, this role is apparent in the scene in which the hero shields a young woman of Nkube from a hyena's attack. When the young woman rose up after she fainted, quote unquote, she yelled 3 times and she clung to Shaka, hanging onto him and kissing him and doing all sorts of things. And she said, quote unquote, I knew it could never be anyone else but you, Shaka, savior of those in the grip of death, where all hope is lost, end of quotation. This statement shows the important role of protector of his people that Shaka, like Sundiata, also played from a young age. In a similar vein, the critic Kwame Aivor states, quote unquote, the growth of Shaka's preeminence conforms to African epic traditions. The frequent fights with his fellow herd boys turned him into an awesome warrior. Shaka's inherent epic attributes are further enhanced by the doctoring provided by the medicine women from Bugane. The immediate outcome of this unusual growth and development is that, like Sundiata, Shaka emerges as the undisputed leader of the herd boys who used to brutalize him. He achieves this feat by beating all his peers into submission. Shaka's protection of the young woman and the village of Nkube from a hyena and previously from a lion outweighs his beating of his mates, sometimes something that Sundiata also does. Shaka's feat suggests that he did embody in his early years positive leadership qualities, such as devotion to his people's safety, that probably explains the status of Pan-African heroes that he occupies in African literature. Discussing this status, the critic Caroline Hamilton writes, quote unquote, for Donald Burness, African literature is inescapably political, and he explored the way in which the figure of Shaka was used as a proud expression of negritude. For Burness, Shaka was a mythical figure that could be reworked to explain the origin and destiny of a people. So it is from a similar perspective that Shaka has earned the status of a Pan-African symbol in Black studies, in spite of the fact that his massive killings of Zulu and Zulu people and members of other Southern African ethnic groups are undeniable. Shaka's immeasurable violent acts are apparent when Appiah engaged right. By 1823, Shaka had conquered all the present-day Natal and left the area in ruin. His massive victories disrupted the clan structure of the interior as clans destroyed each other in their attempts to escape encroaching Zulu. Known as the Mfekane, the crushing, this period of warfare left 2 million dead and enabled the Great Boer Trek of the 1830s to colonize the area easily. As there were few to oppose them, Shaka was fascinated by the ways and artifacts of Europeans, whom he first encountered in 1824. And though he was convinced of the superiority of his own civilization, he allowed them to stay. So in this sense, Shaka's Pan-Africanism can be considered as similar to that of world leaders who call for unity, whose calls for unity led to the colonization of other groups and the slaughter of their own people for egotistical reasons, including a disillusioned sense of grandeur. In this sense, a critic perceives Shaka as an equivalent of Julius Caesar when he writes, both Caesar and Shaka evince a Rubiconesque ambition, an irreversible Macbeth-like vaulting ambition, which overleaps itself and falls on the side beyond one's ends of being onto the ends of being in general. However, Caesar and Shaka exude differently this Rubiconesque ambition in such ways that make Caesar live and die a democratic dictator, while Shaka lives and dies a demonic dictator. It's the critic that's saying that. Shaka's dictatorship was also blatant when he grew up and became a leader who mercilessly subdued other leaders of South Africa, such as for Kazana and Zwide, the latter whom he forced to run to his own death before he ordered all of Zwide's people, men, women, and children be killed, and only the young man be spared. According to Mofolo himself, then when he returned from chasing Zwide, Shaka summoned together all Zwide's young men who had escaped, and he incorporated them into his armies rather than kill them. Therefore, Shaka's Pan-Africanism was largely ill-fated and dictatorial, since it was based on the false notion that one could create unity through the decimation of one's enemies, which is a philosophy that has hampered African continental political unity and economic and cultural integration since the dawn of independence. Africa's development might have been delayed by decades due to the ethnic tensions that many of its leaders, such as Idi Amin, Sekou Touré, Samuel Doe, Charles Taylor, Mobutu Sese Seko, Muammar Gaddafi, Yahya Jammeh, and many others fomented or exacerbated during their regimes to maintain dictatorial rules. So quickly, I would like to move on to Sundiata's story so that we have the opportunity to at least hear both examples from both myths. In Sundiata's story, the hero's birth was foretold by two brother hunters, Olumba and Ulani, who once came to King Nare Magan's Konfata's compound with a young girl from Do that they brought to him as a present because they deemed her worthy to be a king's wife. This woman became the king's spouse and Sundiata's mother. Yet the history of Sogolon Keju also stemmed from a past in which a hunter from Sangaran once met King Nare Magan, and upon the invitation of the sovereign's courtier, agreed to do a divination for the leader. Through his reading of cowries, the hunter foretold a new dawn for the kingdom of Mali through the birth of a child. He said, "O king, the world is full of mystery. All is hidden and we know nothing but what we can see. The silk cotton tree springs from a tiny seed. That which defies a tempest weighs in its germs no more than a grain of rice. Kingdoms are like trees. Some will be silk cotton trees, others will remain dwarf palms, and the powerful silk cotton tree will cover them with its shade. Oh, who can recognize in the little child the great king to come? The great comes from the small. Truth and falsehood have both suckled at the same breast. Nothing is certain, but sir, I can see two strangers over there coming towards your city." In Sundiata's epic, one also finds a direct royal lineage of the hero's parents. Early in the narrative, the buffalo of Do, who appears in human form as Sogolon's mother, tells the two hunters who give her force to kill her in exchange of their generosity, with the condition that they must choose the woman who is called Sogolon Keju. So I would like to first right away talk about some of the connections between the two epics. A similarity between the epics of Sundiata and Shaka is that the former is also reflects the moment when the main hero awakens. And this awakening is depicted in supernatural terms as a new day, not just for him, the hero, but also for his entire nation. In Shaka's epic, the awakening took place during a meeting with Isanusi, his second witch doctor, who transformed him into an innocent person, from an innocent person to an ill-willed one. And of course, Isanusi in this epic of Shaka plays the role of the devil, gives Shaka the power, but in return, assures him that that very power will end up killing him because it's going to lead him to experience an inexhaustive bloodthirstiness, and also a search for glory, a search for conquest that will ultimately consume him. And that's what ended up happening. And the connections between Isanusi and Shaka are worth interpreting and exploring in a separate paper. But due to the interest of time, I'm going to move on to argue that, like Shaka's, Sundiata's epic reflects the trauma of a young child who was ushered by the forced exile and rejection of his mother to return to his homeland. Although in the case of the Malian hero, the ordeals did not take place while the future emperor's father was alive, because we know that most of the ordeals in Sundiata's epic took place after his father passed away, whereas in Shaka's story, most of the ordeals and the tribulations of the hero take place during times when Senzangohona, his father, Shaka's father, was still living. Otherwise, the experiences between the two heroes are quite similar. Like Nandi, Sogolon Keju's, who is Sundiata's mother, is forced to leave or was forced to leave the royal compound due to a co-wife's jealousy, rivalry, and cruelty against one another. Sundiata's power arose from the pain his mother suffered and supernatural circumstances that foretold his rise into a hero. For instance, we learned that Sundiata's power might have come from the fact that he was Sogolon's son and that his mother's mother was the buffalo of Do that nobody could kill without her willing submission and collaboration. So this power transferred to Sogolon Keju, whose marriage King Naremagan could not consummate without scaring the new wife's indomitable spirit. Besides, like Shaka's, Sundiata's birth was an extraordinary event, accentuated with natural phenomena indicating the specialness of the moment. Besides rumbling thunder, swift lightning, a strong wind, one notices how the rain stopped and the sun appeared. And it was at this very moment that a midwife came out of Sogolon's house, ran to the antechamber, and announced to Naremagan that he was the father of a boy. A further parallel between Sundiata and Shaka is noticeable in the fact that when he was born, the future emperor of Mali faced daily humiliations from his mother's co-wives. Also, like Shaka, Sundiata was teased daily by his childhood peers. Yet, Sundiata's predicament was special, since it also had to do with a physical challenge. Sundiata's childhood Sundiata's childhood suffering also stemmed from the abuse of peers due to an infirmity that prevented him to walk for years after he was born. His mother suffered the most as Sasuma Berete, her co-wife, attempted to make her irate. So I'm gonna have to kind of skip some of these passages. And another similarity between the two epics is visible in how, just like Shaka's case, Sundiata's father participated in his and his mother's painful childhood by demanding or allowing that their mothers be expelled from their respective royal compound. According to the griot Mamadou Kouyaté, quote unquote, the disheartened king debarred Sogolon from his house and she lived in semi-disgrace for a while, end of quotation. Soon after, the king Naremagan died, perplexed and aggrieved without seeing his son walk. Sasuma Berete not only further removed Sogolon and her son from her royal compound, but later forced them to leave the kingdom of Nyani. Though, as the narrator suggests, it is Sogolon who made this decision from a legitimate fear that Sasuma would hurt Sundiata's brother. Manding Bori, the son of his father's Naremagan's third wife, Namanje, and his sister Sogolon Kolokan. Thus, Sundiata's fate was sealed by a desire to restore his and his mother's dignity, which was a drive that one notices more in the film version of Shaka made by William C. Ford than in Mofolo's novel. Now, see here I want to talk about the fact that, most of what we know about Shaka comes from William C. Ford's film starring Henry Seeley. And the fact that at least in my own research, I've never been able to secure a photograph of Shaka. So in a sense, like in the minds of a lot of people from both Africa and the diaspora, Shaka is Henry Seeley. We remember Shaka through the image, the popular media and cinematographic image of Henry Seeley. When, in fact, Henry Seeley was not Shaka, he was just an actor. So there is a sense of leadership that one finds in Shaka's, in both the epics of both Sundiata and Shaka. Of course, in what I just talked about earlier, their protective instincts, for their people, the sense of nationalism, the fact that they were both military generals, and good, I would say, fighters and warriors. Despite those connections, there are a number of dissimilarities between these two heroes. And those dissimilarities sometimes revolve around their leadership style. The leadership one finds in Sundiata's epic is one that opposes the Shaka-like management style that consists of intimidating others and forcing them to submission. Unlike Shaka's, Sundiata's leadership epitomizes true Pan-Africanism, since it is founded on the effort to bring Africa's various strong forces to help the downtrodden who are forsaken by dictators. By contrast, Shaka's leadership is akin to that of Smaoro Kante, the Soso king who had stolen Bala Faseke from Sundiata, compelling the Malian griot to extol him as follows, quote unquote, from the epic of Sundiata. All hail, you who wear clothes of human skin, I salute you, you who sit on the skins of kings, end of quotation. These praises reveal Bala Faseke's indirect representation of Smanguru Kante or Smaoro Kante as a king who had no respect for human lives. Smaoro appeared as a Shaka-like king who had made a contract with the devil, which allowed him to defeat his enemies and be almost impossible to kill until a person with good sorcery like Sundiata defied him. The good sorcery that allowed Sundiata to kill Smaoro was a spur of a white cock, which Sundiata placed in an arrow with which he fatally shot the Soso king. But Sundiata would have been unable to know this secret without the help of his half-sister, Nana Triban. Nana Triban, whom Smaoro had stolen from their royal compound after he had invaded Nyani and forced their brother, Dankaran Tuma, into submission. It was Nana Triban that had told Sundiata that, quote unquote, the cock spur was the tanner of Smaoro and had urged him to try to get near to him in battle. We see here an exemplary form of Pan-Africanism in which the Black woman served as family counselor, foreign advisor, and military strategist. Thanks to Nana Triban's tanner, secret, and advice, Sundiata was able to throw an arrow that grazed Smaoro's shoulder, weakening him to the point when he disappeared in a cave leading to a river and was never seen again. The toppling of Smaoro's autocracy is a form of Pan-Africanism or literary Pan-Africanism that has historical resonance, such as the diplomatic and unified ways in which many African leaders sometimes pool their efforts together to restore peace and order in the continent. The epics, I'm going to just conclude before I show just like a short segment from a film. The epics of Shaka Zulu and Sundiata Keita are classical African literary works that deserve to be revisited due to the important lessons they teach about the virtues of Pan-Africanism. Through Shaka's epic, one learns about the hero's initial incarnation of Pan-Africanism through his defense of his community and his resolve to use his experience from forced exile as a way to restore his right to return to his parents' homeland. Yet, as the novel progresses, Shaka abandons such Pan-Africanism, preferring to deploy divisions and brutality as Machiavellian means to crush his opponents and gain power by might rather than by right. In contrast to Shaka's, Sundiata's epic reveals a hero's steady embrace of Pan-Africanism. From childhood to adulthood, Sundiata remained a sturdy individual and leader who used his natural strengths to help his family and the larger community while preparing to claim his right to return to his parents' homeland. Yet, unlike Shaka, Sundiata never abandons the Pan-African ideals that made him a protector of ordinary people. Sundiata never used force and violence against them. Therefore, embodying a consultative and inclusive form of Pan-African leadership, which was a salient literary Pan-Africanism. The contrast between Shaka and Sundiata are lessons that contemporary Africans can revisit to turn the tides of neocolonialism and mere pursuit of power. Africans can draw from the two epics' wisdom to develop Pan-Africanist ways of resisting tyranny and surviving for the benefit of all without recourse to unnecessary violence. Doing so will allow modern Africans, especially leaders, to avoid the ongoing neocolonialism that enables the West to continue to dictate Africa's political, economic, and social futures, development, and security. Now, there is a very important passage, in fact, like a segment of the film that I really would like us to watch, like from the fifth episode, and it shows us the moment when Shaka became a rebel from a young age. So I'm just gonna fast forward it a little bit, just so that we get to that point. There is a scene in which young Shaka challenges his father, Senzan Gahona. And that's
him on their side. Yet we, who know better than any of the prophecy, remain silent. I think the time has come for Shaka to take his place here, in this royal house. He knows nothing about his father, except for the one-sided stories his mother tells him. It is time he heard the truth from your own lips.
And what is the truth?
That you love him.
You never cease to amaze me, my sister.
Your son will soon be a man, and he will come and claim his right as the leader of Amazon. Win him back, brother. Win him back from that woman before it's too late. Before we regret having saved his life.
My prince, I bring you a message from your father, King Senzangakon. He is grieved by the fact that his son has chosen to wander in distant lands to live under foreign kings. He asked for his son's return to the home of his forefathers so that he can publicly and in front of his own people be proclaimed heir to the throne of the House of Zulu.
And what of my mother?
My king requests the return of his son only.
You say Lutuli?
Yes, Ndabezit.
So be it. Tell my father I will be the heir to the throne of the Amazon.
Ndabezit.
Hey, sankulele bafana bamathi. Senizoba isizwe bafana bami. Siyaqiniseka bafana bami ke manje. Nihambe nezitombini bafana bamadoda. Hey, oh, sengiyajabula ke manje senikhulile. Hamba ke insizwa yami manje. Ushaka. Hamba. Hey, ke nawe bafana wami soqinile ke manje.
We have gathered the boys of an age, set to become men.
Today, you boys become men. But first, receive the spear and worship, symbols that you are prepared to fight and to be the shield of Amazon.
Zindon.
Wena wendlovu.
Sukumari. Today, you are all going to receive uncedo, a symbol that you are men. Shaka Zulu, heir to the Zulu throne, step forward.
wear it proudly. My son.
Proudly? Must I wear it proudly? And spit on my mother's pride? Where were you when we nearly died of hunger? Persecuted by the scum of this land. Now that your calf has grown to be a bull with horns, you want him in your royal house? I accept the spear and shield. Symbols that make me a Zulu warrior. But this, I will take by force. As I've made everything that I am, by force. If my mother is not a royal wife, then I know no man by the name of Senzangakho Nagajama.
Enough! Enough! Leave the land of the Zulus now. At sundown, the warriors will follow. If they catch you, they will kill you. Go!
I will be king!
Yeah, I just wanted us to watch that scene because it reflects the ways in which Shaka, a very specific social, psychological, and I would say psychiatric condition that deserves a lot of interpretation and study, and a lot of that, what he goes through has to do with his childhood, with his relationship with Senzangakona, that needs to be deconstructed with, I would say, even probably theories of cognitive science. So I don't want to be taking more time than necessary because I know that I've spoken for quite a long period, and I would like to entertain at least a few questions and comments.
So I see Professor McCann has his hand up. Professor, please go ahead.
Thank you, Babacar. Just this semester, I'm teaching a course just down the hall here, in the African Studies Center, which we're teaching both Sundiata, this version, and also the Thomas Mfolo Chaka. One of the issues that I have to explain when I describe how these efforts to produce a literature have certain issues. For example, Thomas Mfolo is a Sesotho speaker. So he is, of course, Moshweshwe's background included moving into the mountains in Lesotho to escape the Mpakani. So you have an interesting dialogue going on between the author of that book and his description of Shaka Zulu. So I'm wondering how you think about that multilingual issue of such an enduring book. I use it, it works very well. The other thing with Sundiata is it's an oral tradition written down. And I don't know if you know the David Conrad new version that I originally ordered for my course, in which he's using a very literal translation of the oral rendition of the Shaka, of the Sundiata epic. But I went back to the old Nyani because it's much clearer for students. So as you have students reading these two epics, and they're wonderful to use, much better than a dry history text, how you deal with those the linguistic and the issues of using a what is an oral tradition, but it's in written form. And the exile theme you mentioned is critical. It's a wonderful example, and it also gets back to the Hajj in Islam. And the Sundiata epic is aware of Islam. They talk about jinn. They talk about elements of the 12th century Mali Empire in which Islam does play a role, although it's somewhat hidden in the Sundiata. So thank you very much. It was a very enjoyable talk. I got distracted by a colleague momentarily, but I'm back. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Those are really excellent questions. I'm going to address the question related to the use of language in Thomas Mofolo's Shaka. I think Thomas Mofolo was probably conflicted, by the dilemma that, especially indigenous intellectuals, indigenous scholars go through when they have to study the languages and the literatures of their people. On the one hand, there is this attempt to really uncover, unearth, and expose rich oral traditions, rich linguistics, I would say, heritage or heritages. But on the other hand, there is this anxiety that this particular scholar or researcher, I would say folklorist, has in knowing that once the information is exposed, it becomes, I would say, vulnerable. It becomes vulnerable to foreign exploitation. It becomes vulnerable to, I would say, intellectual and critical manipulation and usages. And that's when the issue of translation comes, And I'm not saying that translation, let us say, of the epic of, for instance, Shaka from Lesotho or Sesotho, from Sesotho to English is bad. I'm not saying that. I think, I always believe that negritude or Pan-Africanism is not diluted, by the use of the foreign language. I think they can see the use of the foreign language can still help expand and, I would say, celebrate and study the significance of Sesotho tradition, Sesotho folklore, Sesotho mythology, as is done in this epic of Shaka Zulu. And a similar argument can be made in connection with the epic of Sundiata. It's a translation, it's transcription and translation from Mande to French, to English, and other languages. I think is an opportunity that allows for a greater knowledge, a wider understanding and awareness of the significance of a Pan-African heritage. But there are issues. Anytime there is a translation, there are issues of revolving around the protection of, I would say, and understanding of the authenticity of the original text. I think that's where the problem, one of the problems lies. And other issues stem from the fact that originality, again, it comes to authenticity, originality of voice is lost. It's almost like the relationship between popular culture and folklore, right? Popular culture. Once something becomes popular, then it's commodified, it's being sold, it's being popularized, it's being purchased, it's being protected, kept in places, so there is some good and there's some bad in that, but oftentimes anything that becomes popular, anything that becomes commodified ends up having a lot of repercussions on the value of the culture from which it comes. So there is a certain significance in the protection of the original form, the original language of what is folkloric, So we all need that. And I think one thing that could be done in order to transcend the quandary is to try to seek both heritages, the old texts and the new ones. As you know, Thomas Hale, right? Thomas Hale, we used to teach a comparative literature at Penn State University, did a lot of work also on the Mande traditions, and I think had also some strong interest in the epic of Sundiata. And there are other epics, and I'm definitely going to look for the version that you mentioned by David Conrad. So I guess, your question does provide the answer. It's an answer because you do seem to suggest at least the significance of paying attention or valuing both the translated versions, and the original ones, the ones in the original language. So yeah, thank you. I mean, the questions are very important, and I'm definitely gonna take it into consideration as I continue my research.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Professor Ngom, go ahead.
Babacar, thank you very much for, as always, it's good to see you. Wonderful presentation. So I found interesting in your presentation how the two realms are merged, the realm of the supernatural and the realm of history. So hagiography and history are drawn to project a leader in a particular fashion, in this case as a Pan-Africanist. We find similar merging of hagiographic discourse and historical discourse in the production of heroes in many cultures, including Islamic traditions, including Christian traditions. Jesus might have been a historical agent, but he was also subjected to a lot of hagiographic narratives. So that brings me to the question. I think it's really a theoretical question. For Africa in general, the hagiography and history are not separated. Really, they're interlaced, right? And I want you to reflect on that and help us to rethink about these dichotomies that we often see in academia. Separation between history and hagiography, separation between oral and written. Are these actually separated if we interrogate African sources? My own view is that these are actually complementary when we look at African sources, that the written complements the oral as the oral complements the written. The hagiography, the supernatural is embedded. They all, rather than separated, they form continua. So I wanted to have your reflections on that. And thanks again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Ngom. I definitely agree with you that the written and the oral are not separated in African traditions and in African cosmology. And in a similar vein, one can argue that what is historical and what is hagiographic are not separated. Because, history is fundamentally mythological. It's fundamentally about stories, about, the account of a number of episodes within a particular geographic context. I always tell my students that, first of all, as the saying goes, history is her story, his story. History is an account provided by somebody who says that on this particular day, in this particular place, something happened, you know, just like his name, I think it is from the Epic of Sundiata, isn't that? Yeah, it's in the Epic of Sundiata, the introduction, right? Where the griot tells the reader, you know, did you take the time to tell your reader of which time and in which space and in which place you're talking about? You know, you remember Professor Ngom when we were in at the University of Saint Louis, University of Saint Louis, now called Université Gaston Berger. Remember when they used to teach us African literature? You know, especially when Professor Njawarsa used to teach us African literature, he used to remind us of that passage from the Epic of Sundiata as a reminiscence of a key step in the study of literature, right? In a study of a literary text, which is to tell the audience of which time and of which space, you know, are we talking about, and of which setting, you know, are we talking about? Where did the story take place? How? Where are the characters, etc.? Who are the characters? Why is it important? So what is suggested here is that, at least from an African-centered perspective, a story is a combination of both orality, you know, and I think writing, because as you know, not emphasizing this the written component of African literary production would lead to this ongoing stereotype, right? Bias, which claims that African literature is not written, right, as European and other forms of literatures are. You know, when, as we know, African literature is both written and, of course, spoken. And within that same, I would say, perspective, one can argue that what is historical and what is mythological, or what is, as a term that you use, hagiographic, are intertwined. You know, they're not separated. And I think the connections between these entities stem from the mixture of the profane, right? The profane and the sacred within African cultural cosmology. And Mitty, John S. Mitty, in most of his works, you know, really examines that the interconnected qualities of African philosophy, you know, that entities are brought together. They are never put apart. And that is, and it is like through an exploration of dualities, right? Of dualities and I would say multiplicities, that one can come up with an understanding of the truth, you know, of reality. So thank you very much for that excellent question. I definitely further ponder over it.
Great, thanks. Barbara, go ahead.
I have a question and somewhat of a comment. You spoke of them both in terms of the story, and I really appreciated seeing the parallels in the two stories. I have not read Shaka, but I have read Sundiata many times. And I'm wondering about the different ways that they use their style of presentation, I guess is what you'd call it, because you can't quite say their style of writing, and you can't quite say their style of speaking. Sundiata strikes me as brilliant in its presentation, right from the opening of the griot. And so I'm interested in what you have to say about the two of them together. And then somewhat of a comment and somewhat of a question. I have sometimes tried to have teachers, and I used to work with kindergarten through 12th grade teachers before I retired, to introduce Sundiata when they read also one of the Greek epics, and to put it in a parallel. And so because of that, I tend to see it as having many parallels with Homer, because of my advocacy for putting that into world literature. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you see that?
Yeah, thank you very much. I definitely support the second, idea, the suggestion to teach Shaka's epic or Sundiata's epic alongside those of that Homer and others that are well known. Yeah, because they're definitely about human trials and tribulations. They're about the anxieties of exile, the consequences of childhood suffering, physical dislocation, geographical dislocations. They're about literally a number of elements that are still going on, number of forms of oppression, the status of the refugee populations throughout history, can be, and other themes can be explored through, I would say, interpretation, studies of these narratives, of these epics. So I think that these epics can be taught, should be taught at schools. They can help a variety of students from around the world have a greater appreciation of African heritage, and also its multiplicity. As you hinted in your first question, or which is also excellent, I really like the question and the comments, the initial question and comments that you made. Both, it is difficult to talk about these epics, especially in about the narration, by saying that they, the way they write or the way, I think that's what you said. We can talk about, the writings, as belonging to, because the original writing was in Mande, the original, when it comes to Sundiata's epic, the original writing was in, when it comes to Shaka's epic. But we can still, I guess, in a sense, from another angle, talk about how Jibril Tamsir Nyan has translated the story, right? We can also talk about how the English narrative was translated by F.H. Dutton first, right? And then by Daniel, the University of Wisconsin Press, However, one thing we can definitely talk about, which actually is the reason why I am drawn to these stories, is the cinematographic qualities. And I've talked to people, in fact, if you just want to give a talk on Chaka, people are interested even before hearing you talk, because most of us have been touched by Chaka, in our childhood, during our education, at some point we've read one of these, I'm sure, or sometimes even we've read both of them and more. And there are other stories that are similar to these. So we most of us have had the opportunity to watch the film, or films. I haven't seen a film about Sundiata yet. I would love to see that. But we've all seen at least two films about Shaka. And to me, the novel the novel form of Shaka's story, which is also an epic, and the epic of Sundiata, written by, or I would say, produced by Jibril Tamsir Nyan, are cinematographic because they focus on characters. You have close-up shots, you have a very, creative sceneries, you have very important use of light, and you have excellent dialogues. You have characters that are larger than life. They're really epics, what's the, when you think about Hollywood, the greatest epics are Ben-Hur, right? Another great epic is the Ten Commandments, right? And there are many others. Anytime I watch those epics, my mind goes to Sundiata's epic, Sundiata's story. And I begin to ask myself, why isn't there a film about Sundiata? And one that would be almost like the Ten Commandments. And I begin just to hope that somebody would just like one day, find so much significance in African oral traditions that they would be investing a lot of money and going to Nyani, going to Mali, and going to Guinea, and hopefully make a film out of this wonderful story. So that's just what I wanted to say. There was something else that I also wanted to talk about in relationship to the griot. Yes, the griot. The ways in which the dialogues are constructed in the stories. The ways in which the memory, remembrances, in fact, that way reminds us of Usman Semben's film, Shadow, where one finds similar griot performances that reflect the importance of diplomacy in African oral traditions, the importance of language, the importance of ethos, pathos, etc., and all the other importance of rhetoric, or at least rhetoric as theorized from a Western standpoint. But thank you very much for that question and comments.
Great. Thanks, David. Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was great. And I especially like the parallels that you drew between Masisi Kunene's Shaka Zulu and Ndihinyane's Sundiata. And to me, that was one of the best parts of your talk. I am interested in Pan-Africanism. I'm especially interested in African languages because that's my background. I've always been interested in oral tradition and written literature, especially in African languages. And that's where I've done most of my research. And one of the things I did was I did do quite a bit of work with the whole question of what should we do? Should we write literature in African languages or should we write it in European languages? And I published a couple of articles about that in the early 90s, where it was really a hot topic. And I've been revisiting that recently. And to me, what I've been able to gather so far, it isn't such a hot topic anymore. And the reason for that is because people have made peace with it. There's no single answer to it. But I wanted to ask you, for me as a point of information, you've said so much about Pan-Africanism, and I apologize if you've said this already and I didn't catch it, but is there a history of conversation on this point in the history of Pan-Africanism? Has it come up? Has it come up often? Has it come up just a little? That kind of thing. That's my question.
Oh yeah, thank you very much. That is an excellent question. The issue of language has been very important in Pan-Africanism, but specifically in relationships to negritude. We all remember the 1970s when Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan writer, and also Wole Soyinka, the Nigerian writer, took a stance against Leopold Sédar Senghor, whose celebration of African civilization, African culture, they found problematic because it did not bring to the foreground Senghor's, what they reviewed as Senghor's almost imitative fascination with European culture, with European traditions. Senghor's the strong and unrestrained influence of the French ways of seeing things, French ways of living in Senghor's ideology, Senghor's even political orientations. Senghor had a boundless love of the French language, and one of the things that I like about him is he did not perceive that as paradoxical or contradictory to the Pan-Africanist ideal, the Pan-Africanist goal of unifying people of African descent or even of exposing, uncovering the richness of the African traditions. And I do agree with Senghor from that standpoint, because in the 1950s, for instance, right, if you had asked a young Senegalese going to school, what Africa was about, or what was civilization, they most likely wouldn't have a greater sense, because up to that time, Africans were mostly being told that their contribution to civilization was minimal, and that text, whatever they saw in their textbook, focused more on the European traditions, European cultures. I remember my mother telling me that, they had to memorize French poetry, like Le Cid, Voltaire, etc. All of these. My generation and Professor Ngom's generation, we also had to demonstrate a good knowledge of French literature, French culture. But luckily, we had the teachers who exposed us to the writings of Djibril Tamsir Niane, Seydou Badian, and other great African, of course, Ousmane Sembène, and other great African writers, in order to prevent, that lack of exposure to our traditions, our culture. So it's almost like, and I think that stemmed from Senghor's own political orientation. Senghor did not see, I would say, the mastery of the French language as paradoxical in the goal towards development, for development. So he wanted us to have both tradition and modernity, therefore, in an intertwined way. So the tradition and modernity could have come from the French language or the African languages, but I think could be reflected in the interpretation of the text, and also in one's own ethics. So while I didn't see that as a problem, or why I still don't see that as a problem, Senghor's use of language and his combination, his fascination with the French language, Wole Soyinka and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and a number of other African intellectuals, especially of the 1970s, saw that as problematic. And of course, we are very familiar with Ngugi wa Thiong'o's respect for Gikuyu, but despite his temporary interest in Gikuyu, Ngugi wa Thiong'o writes primarily in English. So at least as Professor David Wesley had just talked about, suggested here, Africans have settled with that issue. At least a number of critics, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o is one of them. So at least that is a good example. The fact that most of his work is in English. Now, when it comes to Wole Soyinka, he mostly writes in English. So which therefore made their criticism against Senghor quite paradoxical, because they themselves write in English, and through their work, one can discover the significance of either Kenyan or Nigerian mythologies. So therefore, I think their criticisms against Senghor remains baffling, when we all know that Senghor is one of the writers that captured, I think, certain elements about African traditions, African societies, like in unique ways, again, without falling into essentialism, right? Without falling into essentialism. I'm trying to be very careful there. I can just say that Senghor has been able to use the French language to represent Africa. I could use represent in unique ways, in fascinating ways.
But I have just an image to share from my own personal experience. I lived in Maiduguri, which is right near three French-speaking African countries. Of course, Maiduguri was in Nigeria, an English, English-speaking country. But from N'Djamena, Chadians would come over the border and talk to the Nigerians in Maiduguri, and the Chadians would say, "We are French and you are English," and the Nigerians would say, "No, we speak English, but we are not Nigerians. You can't, you're not French. And they would say, yes, we are French. And that's part of my point in a way. So if you have a comment about that, fine, but if not, that's all right too.
Yeah, you're right. You know, so I think what you're speaking to here is really important. That's that very strange set of interactions and relationships between Anglophone and Francophone and Lusophone Africans, you know, but more so between the Anglophone and the Francophone Africans, you know, and because like Senegal, and Professor Gum can also speak to this, Senegalese like to pride themselves in being the France of West Africa, you know. Okay, you mentioned Dakar. Used to be that whenever you mention Dakar, they say, oh, Dakar is the Paris of Africa. Okay, really? You mentioned Saint Louis, you go to Saint Louis and you mention Saint Louis and they say, oh, this is where this was created, founded by the French. So we are, of course, the French of, you know, Africa. We are, of course, the Paris of Africa. And imagine, so when you talk about England, you know, when you talk about Kenya, you know, for some reason, in one way or another, London is there, London. You know, you can even find it in the literature, you know, whether it's it's about the writings of Chinua Achebe or let's say the joys of motherhood of Buchi Emecheta. Somehow, you know, there's going to be a character that winds up in London. Why not in the United States? You know, why not in Lisbon? You know, but somehow that connection between Anglophone Africa and the English-speaking world outside of Africa is reinforced. And when it comes, especially England, with England, and when it comes to Senegal, France is there. You know, you can see it in the work of Ousmane Sembène, like the Black Docker, the Docker Noir. You can see it in Cheikh Hamidou Khan's novel, The Ambiguous Adventure, L'Aventure Ambiguë, you know. And so it's interesting to know that those interactions between Anglophone and Francophone Africans go back to, I think, perceived attitudes towards colonialism. That's what I would say. You know. I mean, how many times have we heard that, you know, the English-speaking Africans fought for their independence? They really fought. You know, they had to fight. You know, look at Kenya. You know, got the Mau Mau War. You know, you got different other types of wars. You go to Nigeria, the same thing. Whereas there is this false, I would call it false, right? False assumption that the anti-colonial struggle, let us say, in some parts of Francophone Africa was not as violent, was not as harsh as the anti-colonial struggle in some parts of English-speaking Africa. You know, that's the best politically correct way I can say. But we do know that all forms of colonialism were brutal, you know, even if they had the appearance of neutrality, of not being as harsh as they were. You know, colonialism cannot be nuanced. You know, it was terrible, it was brutal in all its forms. Yeah, but thank you very much, Professor Wesley.
Great.
Professor Mali?
Yes, please go ahead.
Hello, sir. Oh, thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation. Mine, I'm not sure if it's a question, but I'm sure it is a comment. Looking at just your presentation about these magnanimous sons of Africa, I couldn't help but think about a gathering that is upcoming, talking about the intangible cultural heritage of at least South Africa. And I'm looking at the clip that you showed. I was captured by the portrayal of what I consider the softer side of the so-called savage Shaka. The fact that he stood there fighting for his mother, it just made me think of D.H. Lawrence's book, Sons and Lovers, because he was prepared to not even go where he's supposed to go if his mother is not being recognized. So I just was touched by this highlighting of intangible forms of cultural heritage in this form of transmission. I have not read Sundiata, but I have read and I have listened to Shaka. And one of the ways also, when you mentioned that it helps if we go to the primary sources before the translations and everything. There are poems written about him, Isibongos and Nkosi Shaka, which bring out a lot of what we have said, and you know, it can enhance our understanding of who Shaka was. Besides the fighting savage, there is also the softer human in him. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly, and that's exactly what I'm trying to do, to reflect the Shaka's complexity as a human being, the fact that a lot of the images that have been perpetuated by Hollywood need to be deconstructed, critiqued, and in fact, you know, there is a reason why Shaka's story and even the film, especially the film, is often not explored, often not studied, you know, because first of all, in the Western world, there is, you know, especially given the scholarship on identities, right? You know, there is a certain fear, I would say, within the Western world to really tackle any text that can give the impression of primitivism or primitivizing, you know, like the representation of people of African descent or Africa as savage, undeveloped, backward, in contrast to a Europe or the Western world that is regarded as advanced, you know, detaining or modernity, you know, having civilization, etc. You know, a lot of intellectuals, a lot of scholars, a lot of critics are afraid of being involved in a scholarship that ends up, I would say, perpetuating the myth of diffusionism. You know, and the myth of diffusionism is the idea that every great thing comes from Africa, like was diffused, no, from the West, was diffused from the Western world into the formerly colonized world. So when we, all of us, when we approach these things, we're kind of a little bit scared. You know, we're like, okay, I mean, Shaka, that's a really complicated text, especially William C. Ford's films, you know, because of course, Hollywood likes to do that. They like to play, you know, on the idea of what is savage, the idea of what is primitive. Now, against this tide, against this tradition of, I would say, filmic cinematographic manipulation of African traditions and African images, I'm trying to focus on what you just talked about, like the human, you know, the respect for mothers, you know, the respect for women, the respect for girls, the respect for infants, you know, the importance of virtues, the importance of values, the importance of caring for one's community, you know, the importance of love, the importance of, I would say, being strong, not just physically, but also mentally, socially, politically, ideologically, religiously, etc. You know, the importance of rites, of rituals, you know, like in that particular sense, the relationship between Isanusi and Chaka, right, can be studied further. Of course, Isanusi appears as really evil, but Isanusi told Chaka that I can give you the power, you know, but it's up to you. Isanusi actually gives Chaka an existential choice, especially, and that is mostly visible in the book form of the story. Isanusi tells Chaka, this is it, you choose. But if you choose, don't come and blame me. You're the one that's gonna decide to do the right thing or to do the wrong thing. But let me tell you, doing the wrong thing gives you all these things. You're gonna have power over others. You're gonna, your kingdom will have power over others. You know, you will have, you will dominate people. You will dominate societies and men, decide who's gonna live and who's gonna die. Isanusi laid all the cards in front of Shaka and let him choose. You know, so there's, I think, something to say there about African traditions, about choice, about reason, about logic, and especially about what you talk about, women and gender. You know, which are themes that are really neglected, I think, in most of these scholarship that we do. the valuation of mothers. I mean, that is just something, there's something unique in how our heroes and our heroines value their mothers, in how mothers are, I mean, I tell my students that mothers are worshipped, at least in Senegal. That's what I tell them. Of course, in America, there is this emphasis on the separation between church and state. But in my classes, I tell students, one of the things I will never do in Africa or in Senegal is insult somebody's mother. I will never do that. I tell my students, I tell them that if I do that, I may not live long. I may not even live further than 20 minutes to tell a story. And I tell them, okay, here I do walk around. I hear people swearing left and right, this and this, somebody's mother this, somebody's mother that. And I tell them that is something that we in Senegal have been taught to never, ever do, because not only is it rude, but because also Senegalese society is one in which people swear by, leave by their mother's name. That's what it is. They leave by their mother's name, meaning therefore that they would rather die than see their mothers and their fathers. I'm not forgetting fathers. They would rather die than see their mothers or fathers be humiliated. And I think it is universal, right? It's not just in Senegal. It's also in many parts of Africa, almost, I would say everywhere, every African country, and also abroad. It is also abroad. Yeah, but thank you for those comments. And I'll definitely look into for those poems that you mentioned.
Great, thanks. So it's 2:06. We're actually 6 minutes over time, and I think Professor Mbai, that speaks really to how powerful your presentation has been and how much the audience enjoyed it. But let me take the moderator's prerogative and ask. I have to at least get one question in, and that is, I wonder if we could return to the transatlantic question or issue that you raised at the beginning of your presentation. And obviously, this. It's quite powerful, I think, the way in which you described, these two epics have been part of a sort of Pan-African tradition, very much concerned with continental unity and the continental question. But I wonder, I'm curious, because I don't know, how those concerned with the transatlantic question, right? Pan-Africanism in the transatlantic context have thought about these two figures, right? Shaka Zulu, Sundiata, Keita. What have been the representations of these figures amongst this Pan-African literary tradition concerned with the transatlantic issue, transatlantic unity, Black solidarity across the transatlantic? Are these thinkers relevant? Are they being talked about? Are they being discussed? Are there parallels between these discourses, the transatlantic one and the continental one? Thank you so much again. Fascinating presentation.
Yes, thank you very much. To my knowledge, the parallels between these two epics, these two heroes, are really neglected in the discourses on transatlantic unity, Black transnational connections. In fact, this is the reason why I am working on this particular topic. Because first of all, there is just like a general, I would say, unfamiliarity with African epics, I would say in Black studies, in transnational Black studies. And just like a general, I would say, unfamiliarity with the complexities of African traditions. There's a lot of scholarship on what is known as African retentions, African cultural influences on the cultures and the literatures of Blacks of the diaspora. A lot has been produced, and this goes back to the works of Melville J. Herskovits, right? And even further, it goes back to the works of, for instance, the author of that book, Africanisms in the Gala dialect, right? Lorenzo Turner, Africanisms in the Gala dialect. And of course, up through the 1980s and the 1990s, we were able to see, for instance, during those time periods, the excellent scholarship on Afrocentrism, right? From the Afrocentric school, Modificate Asante's work, Afrocentricity, and the other works. So there's no denying that transnational Black studies and the study of the relationship between Blacks, across the Atlantic world has increasingly paid attention to African cultures, African traditions. But my concern is that, there has been less, I would say, critical approach to these traditions, and I think being critical in the approach, it revolves around talking about what was great, but also what was problematic. Like what is great in the text, but also what is problematic in the text. You see, what is Thomas Mofolo doing really by exposing both the limitations and the strength of Shaka Zulu? See, I want our students to be able to do that. But unfortunately, if for instance, like I'm in a class and I'm teaching the epic of Shaka Zulu, and from the onset, a number of my students might assume that placing the study of that text within an African-centered perspective or point of view revolves only around talking about the greatness of Shaka or talking about the greatness of Sundiata. Whereas, being critical, and by talking also about the limitations of their leadership style, about, for instance, the problems in their own, I would say, personal philosophical orientations would be part of the intellectual activity. In other words, to me, respecting Africa and respecting African traditions does not necessarily mean perceiving everything about the African traditions within the particular text as essentially fantastic, because history did not happen that way. Cultures are not intrinsically that way. People have flaws, they have positives and negatives, therefore there are strengths and limitations in anything. And I think the writer, such as Thomas Mofolo or Jibril Tamsir Nyan they want us to just be critical, and aware. They want us first to be aware of the complexities of these traditions and their representations, but also be able to critique them based on our new realities. But to be honest with you, Professor Waldemariam, Black studies scholars have neglected these epics. They're aware of them. They are aware of them, but there used to be a time in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s when these stories received more scholarly recognition, more, I would say, in Black studies in general than now.
Great, thank you so much for answering that question. And so I'm going to give you a digital ovation here, and I think we can all clap for the professor for a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, and I wish everyone a good rest of their Monday. Professor, I hope we can stay in touch. Thank you again.
Thank you.